Hello and welcome to this next RapidStream tutorial. Well, this time we will look a bit more into the theory of URLs. I will show you what happens when you create ad server configurations. So, in order to understand what I'm telling you, you should have at least watched our ad server configuration tutorial and probably also our kill switch tutorial, but it's not that necessary. So as you may remember, in our ad server configuration, there are all these conditions we can configure. Placeholders, existence checks, mappings, all that stuff. And we can define keys and target keys and values. But what happens if we add those configurations? Well, let's have a look. So what you see on my screen now are two very important components. First of all, we have above here the client, which can be a smart TV, a laptop, a mobile phone, doesn't matter. Probably there's an app running on there and the user uses this app to stream. So what happens now is the user is opening the app, selects a channel and hits the play button. So the client now has to ask our system for a VAST. To do so, he's simply doing a GET request. He has some URL configured, and this URL is pointing to one of our services in the cloud. Our service is now reading the URL, parsing it, and depending on its content, it does different things, like adapting kill switches if one matches, and also looks into the ad server configuration. We'll get to that soon. Let's have a look at the URL for a moment. Okay, let's see. Let's first remove the distractions here, so we can concentrate on our URL. So, well, the URL is split into different parts. We have the base URL here, which you have to configure. We have the endpoint here. And we have some request parameters, which are those. The base URL, which is yellow, is configured on your site and is probably static, you won't change it. And the endpoint, if you want to, defines what you get back. So in this case, you want a VAST, so the endpoint is VAST. Well, the really interesting parts of the URL right now are the red ones. Those are the parameters. So keep in mind our service now has parsed the URL and has all the parts, all the keys and values you see here in red at hand. So you may remember all those configurations you could do in the customer panel of RapidStream. And if you look at the sample URL here, some parts might look familiar to you, like the country or GDPR. You might recognize that from the other tutorials. So what's happening here is that we get that VAST request from your client, and we will take that URL and we transform that URL to an ad server request. So the first thing that will happen is that we check if there's a kill switch matching. Let's ignore that for now. The next thing is we'll look into the ad rules and see if any rule is matching for our URL here. And according to that match, we will decide which ad server should be used. And then we're transforming this client URL, and then we will transform this URL you see on the screen to a URL the ad server can handle. And in this process, we can transform keys and values in the URL. For example, let's take GDPR. Let's assume your app sends a GDPR is true parameter in the URL, as you can see here on the screen. See? So your app sending GDPR is true to our system. The ad server, on the other hand, doesn't know what to do with this parameter. It needs something like constant is 1, for example. So now you may remember that we can do some matching or some checks in the configuration. So what we could do now to transform this GDPR parameter to a constant parameter for the ad server is we add a configuration in the panel which looks like this. And as you can see, we added an existence check. We are looking for the key GDPR. And if the key is given, then the target key, constant, will get the value 1. Otherwise, the constant will have the value 0. So what happens now is, whenever GDPR is in the URL you send us, we will say, okay, perfect, there might be a constant. Let's add a constant parameter to the ad server URL and set it to 1. This configuration might not be perfect, because probably you can also send us GDPR false and then the parameters in the URL, and we will send a constant 1 because it's just an existence check. So it's important to really think of what kind of rule you need here. You should always keep that in mind. In this case, a conditional rule might be better, but that depends on your system. Speaking of conditional rules, let's have another look at our sample URL here. Beside that GDPR parameter, we also have that country parameter here. So let's use this parameter to do some conditional mappings. Let's assume that your app is sending us a country like DE for Germany. The problem is your ad server needs a region like US or Europe. So what we can do is now create a conditional configuration. Our key is country. Our target key may be region. And now we can do some mapping. Let's say country code DE for Germany will lead to a region Europe. And also UK will lead to region Europe. All the other countries should just be in the region world. So what happens now is whenever you request a VAST and you have a country parameter in the URL, we will look at its value, and depending on the value, we will adapt your rule you just defined. So in our sample, the country is DE, so it will be transformed into region is Europe. Now if somebody comes with some country, let's say AT for Austria, as we didn't configure any mapping for that, that will default to region world. Let's look at one more thing, and you may have noticed that user ID here at the end, and I didn't finish the example here. Let me quickly fix that, because it will probably look like something like user ID ABC. Let's take that for now. The user ID also comes from your system. It could be set in the app the user is using. You probably have some user account there and it got a user ID. So what we have in our system currently are 3 contexts. We have the request context, which are the parameters in the URL like country. We can have a user context, and we can have an EPG context. What we can do with that is we can do even more complex matchings or replacements. So whatever we do here is we replace keys and values in the URL, right? Like we transform country DE to region is Europe, or GDPR true to constant is 1. Those examples are request context examples because we just take data from the URL itself. But we could also get data from other contexts. We can have a user context and we can have an EPG context because you can ingest your EPG data into our system. So if you take this example and the user ID ABC, you can configure your ad server configurations so that we, whenever we get a user ID, try to look up that ID. And if we get more information about that user, we can add that configuration to the ad server request URL. For example, if our system knows that user ID ABC has 2 IAB categories attached to its profile, we can send that categories to the ad server, and the user will get more personalized advertisements. We could also switch that user ID and say it's an EPG ID. And then we can look into the EPG data you're ingested into our system. And for example, say, okay, EPG ID 123 has a genre, a specific genre, and we can send that genre information to the ad server. So the ad server can return fitting ads for that genre. All that can be done in the ad server configuration. And it also depends on what data we get from you and what data you put in the URL. So let's do a quick recap. The client is requesting a VAST, and the client has a URL configured which is the base URL, which has an endpoint for the VAST, and which comes with some parameters. So before we send the request to the ad server, we adapt the URL regarding the configuration you did in the customer panel. We fill placeholders from the request context, so the data in the URL, or the user context, or the EPG context. And we do some sort of mapping. We translate parameters like translate country to a region in our example. With all the transformations in the URL, we will request the ad server, and we will get a response from your ad server and create the final VAST, send it back to your client, and he can stream your program and gets advertisements, in our example, for the region Europe, and hopefully he has a consent given, and maybe he gets advertisements for a special genre, or if there's a user ID, he gets advertisements fitting his IAB categories and his personal interests. So this is what happens with the ad server configuration and the URL you request the VAST from. I hope that was easy to understand. I know it's very theoretically, but I think I made it clear what happens with the URL and all the configurations you can do in the customer panel. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. We're here to help. And hopefully we will see you soon in one of our next tutorials. See you then. Bye-bye.